Our first Bible reading this morning is from 1 Kings chapter 19, and I'm reading verses 1 to 4, 5 to 7, 8 to 15a. Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, "So may the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life like the life of one of them by this time tomorrow." Then he was afraid. He got up and fled for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah. He left his servant there. But he himself went on a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a solitary broom tree. He got up and ate and drank. Then he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God. At that place he came to a cave and spent the night there. Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." He said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire a sound of sheer silence. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Then there came to him a voice that said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." Then the Lord said to him, "Go. Return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. When you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael as king over Aram." And our second reading today is from Luke chapter 8, verses 26 to 39. Then Jesus and the disciples arrived at the country of the Gerasenes, which is opposite Galilee. As Jesus stepped out on land, a man of the city who had demons met him. For a long time he had worn no clothes, and he did not live in a house but in the tombs. When he saw Jesus, he fell down before him and shouted at the top of his voice, "What have you done with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, do not torment me." For Jesus had commanded that the unclean spirit to come out of the man. For many times it had seized him. He was kept under guard and bound with chains and shackles, but he would break the bonds and be driven by that demon into the wilds. Jesus then asked him, "What is your name?" He said, "Legion," for many demons had entered him. They begged him not to order them to go back into the abyss. Now there on a hillside, a large herd of swine was feeding, and the demons begged Jesus to let them enter these. So he gave them permission. Then the demons came out of the man and entered the swine, and the herd rushed down the steep bank into the lake and was drowned. When the swineherds saw what had happened, they ran off and told it in the city and in the country. Then people came out to see what had happened, and when they came to Jesus, they found the man from whom the demons had gone, sitting at the feet of Jesus, clothed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. Those who had seen it told them how the one who had been possessed by demons had been healed. Then all the people of the surrounding country of the Gerasenes asked Jesus to leave them, for they were seized with great fear. So he got into the boat and returned. The man from whom the demons had gone begged that he might be with him. But Jesus sent him away, saying, "Return to your home and declare how much God has done for you." So he went away, proclaiming throughout the city how much Jesus had done for him. And this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Thank you, Jan, for reading those long readings. They happen to be two of my favourite in the Bible. And funny enough, they're today listed in the church's readings for this Sunday. I love the imagery of those two readings. I love the tone, I love the drama, and more so I love the theology and what it has to speak to us in this time. Those words in the Bible, the story has spoken into my life, and I imagine and I hope many others. I love how God can speak through those words. And it's interesting how the church has placed those two readings side by side. And we read together, and I don't think we can help but notice the theme yelling out at us. The still small voice of God. Reflecting on these passages and on this theme of the voice of God, I noticed the voice of God to Elijah and that of Jesus to the so-called man who is called the demoniac, or Legion as he's called. This story, this occurrence happens in and around turmoil, around chaos, violent conditions. Does God speak through these occasions? Does God speak through these experiences? Does God speak in a loud, booming voice? We might think that God speaks only in those ways. That is attention-grabbing, frightening language, slamming doors, experiences like earthquakes and floods and tornadoes and plagues and famines and so on, which is pretty much an Old Testament view of how God does speak and an understanding of God. But where is God in all of this? In all of this chaos, this violence and busyness and loudness. So today I've entitled the sermon, "In There, Somewhere, is the Still Small Voice of God." In there somewhere is the still small voice of God. So Elijah, we heard in the first reading, the prophet of the Old Testament, and Legion, the man in the New Testament. Both are depressed. Both are hiding. Both are experiencing turmoil and stress and shadows and rough days. Both of them are having bad hair days, if they had any hair. And they wish that they hadn't got out of bed that day. Both were facing their demons. Now, I know there would be a variety of definitions of demons among us this morning. But for argument's sake, I want to call demons today, there's things like fear and rejection, loneliness, hurt, guilt, anger. Common situations in which we find ourselves with shared experiences. In these experiences, we might ask, well, where is God? How does God speak into these times? Some of our everyday demons could also be like facing surgery, kids growing up, or leaving home, or just being kids. The loss of a loved one, job issues, relationship issues, busyness of everyday issues, financial, exams, life-changing, partner or spouse issues. Often we look for God in these moments, and we want to hear God in the loud and the spectacular, the mountain-splitting stuff. When life is in turmoil, often our surroundings mimic our understanding of God sometimes. What I mean by that is when we feel tossed and out of control, we expect God to speak or respond loudly or dramatically, in a strong and even somewhat violent way. But if I'm honest and I think hard and long about it, and for a long time I don't think God has ever spoken to me, or I felt God's touch in a violent or loud or fast or deafening way. I've yelled at God, but God has never yelled at me. I've been angry at God, and I've made physical gestures toward God, but God has never acted that way to me. I rush here and there, often demanding I find God, but God has always found me. I might ignore God, and I have done, and I've given God the silent treatment, but God has always listened. And when I stop and think about it, God often speaks in the calm, in the still, in the loving voice, and usually when the earthquake, with the wind and the fire of my circumstance and my experience, or most times my perception of my experience, when all that settles down, the smoke is gone and the dust settles, then it is that God whispers, "Bob." I think that is part of discernment. That is taking time in retreat to be still and to sit and to listen. After Elijah experiences the earthquake, the storm and the fire, then comes the still, sheer, small, silent voice. And in that silence, the voice, God says, "Elijah, what are you doing here?" Sometimes we look for God in the spectacular, but God is not always in the spectacular. Sometimes the spectacular is the sheer silence or calm. Jesus met a man one day who was experiencing all these experiences. The same as Elijah, but different. This guy that Jesus met was being tormented. His life was chaotic. The man we read today in the text from the New Testament was daily tormented by demons for whatever they were. He was an outcast living in the tombs, in the graveyard, in a cemetery, naked, often chained, but he would break free. He heard voices in his head, and he acted accordingly. He was a man who you would not want to meet down a dark alley, or any alley for that matter. He meets Jesus. In his turmoil and his aggression, Jesus speaks a word into his life, and he is healed. To me, that story speaks loudest by highlighting that at one time, this wild man, this uncontrollable and strong man, was out of control. And by contrast, when Jesus comes along and speaks, asking his name, there is transformation. There is calm. There is peace. Remember the story in Genesis, the creation story? The earth was formless and void. Chaos covered the deep, and then God spoke. And what happened? Order came out of chaos. Jesus speaks, be still. Jesus says, peace be with you. The first half of this story about Legion, the guy in the New Testament, is violent, it's fast, strong images, it's rugged, it's tough. But in the second half, we notice that this man is transformed. Now at the feet of Jesus. Calm, quiet, clothed. There is dignity. There is no shame or guilt. He is in his right mind, at peace, and is open. He is changed enough that he desires to follow Jesus. But Jesus there says, no, you go back to your village and speak of what God has done for you. This man, perhaps for a long time, was out of control. Now, after the encounter with Jesus, after hearing the voice of God in Jesus, speaks into his life calmly, quietly, and peacefully. And I look at this passage and I ask myself, where is this guy's presence of stillness? It is at the feet of Jesus. This guy found peace in the presence and voice of Jesus, God incarnate. Where was Elijah's presence of stillness? Not in the acts of violence and storms and earthquakes, but in the stillness and quietness. And I wonder, are we feeling like Elijah or even Legion? Are we experiencing turmoil and stress and strain and storms in our lives? Yes, we are. Individually and as a community. Are we running away like Elijah? Hiding from someone or something? Are we, or do we feel that we've been pushed and pulled to breaking point? Screaming. Do we prefer to hide in caves or cemeteries of loneliness and despair and guilt, and even pushing people away? I think we do. I do. And I think we all do. We all experience this sometime in our lives. Some more, some less, and some in different ways and some in other ways. Do we cry out and begging God to show up and intervene? Or do we and can we be still and sit and listen? Sometimes it's not easy. It's not easy a lot. It's hard. But God does, and God will speak often in that moment of quietness and gentleness rather than the noisy and the dramatic. I've said enough. For these are my words. And today I'd rather let God speak. To let God have the opportunity to speak into our lives. I'd rather us hear the voice of God in the stillness and speak the word that each of us needs to hear. We may not be in need to hear that today, but maybe we are. Therefore, I want to invite us to take a few moments to sit and be still and be quiet. To be ready to listen and open to listening. In a moment, we'll stand and we'll sing a song and become open with listening ears, and more importantly, open our hearts, perhaps to the opportunity to hear or feel the presence of God speak into us, into our lives, your life, my life. Go and stand before me on the mountain, the Lord told him. And as Elijah stood there, the Lord passed by, and a mighty wind hit the mountain. It was such a terrible blast that the rocks were torn loose. But God was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake. But God was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake was a fire. But God was not in the fire. And after the fire, there was the sound of a gentle whisper.